A forgotten cabin, a buried metal box, and a daughter about to discover that her father didn't abandon her. He disappeared to save her life. The road to the cabin looked smaller than Sarah remembered. Trees leaned over the narrow dirt path like they were trying to hide the place from the world. Rain tapped softly against her windshield, while the old truck struggled over rocks and muddy ground. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the cabin slowly appeared through the fog. For a moment, she stopped breathing. It was still there. The faded blue walls looked weaker now, and the porch sagged slightly to one side, but nothing else had really changed. The same crooked chimney stood above the roof. The same wooden swing moved gently in the wind even though nobody had touched it in years. Sarah stared at it quietly. 23 years. 23 years since she had last seen this place. The truck engine died, leaving only the sound of rain and distant thunder. Sarah stayed seated for a few seconds longer, almost hoping the cabin would disappear if she looked away. But it didn't. She finally stepped outside. Cold wind hit her face immediately. The air smelled like wet wood, pine trees, and old memories she had spent half her life trying to forget. Her boots sank slightly into the mud as she walked toward the porch. Creak! The old wooden steps groaned beneath her weight. Sarah glanced around nervously, as if the cabin itself remembered her. A rusted lantern still hung beside the front door. One of the windows remained cracked exactly the way it had been the night everything changed. Even the wind sounded familiar here. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver key. Her mother had given it to her years ago. "Keep it," she had said coldly. "One day the cabin will belong to you." At the time, Sarah didn't want it. She wanted answers instead. But answers never came. Not from her mother. Not from the police. And definitely not from her father. Sarah slid the key into the lock. For a second, her hand froze. A memory flashed through her mind. Her father kneeling beside her near the fireplace. Smiling, telling her stories while snow fell outside the windows. Then another memory replaced it. Her mother crying in the kitchen. Police officers standing near the porch. Voices whispering the same sentence over and over again. "He's gone." Sarah quickly pushed the door open before the memories could swallow her completely. Dust filled the air instantly. The cabin smelled abandoned. Old wood creaked softly beneath her feet as she stepped inside. Weak daylight slipped through the dirty windows, casting pale shadows across the room. Everything looked frozen in time. The stone fireplace still stood in the center of the room. A bookshelf leaned against the wall with several missing books. The old couch remained covered with a white sheet stained by years of dust. Sarah walked slowly through the silence. Every object felt like it was watching her. On the small table beside the fireplace sat a framed photograph. She stopped. It was her favorite picture from childhood. She was 8 years old in the photo, smiling with missing front teeth while sitting beside her father near the lake behind the cabin. His arm rested around her shoulders protectively. Sarah picked up the frame carefully. Her father's face still carried the same warm smile she remembered. For years, she tried convincing herself she no longer cared about him. That he had abandoned them. That he chose to leave. But standing inside that cabin again made those lies harder to believe. Because memories of him were everywhere. The fishing rod hanging near the door. His old boots beside the stairs. Even the tiny marks carved into the kitchen wall, showing Sarah's height as she grew older. Her chest tightened painfully. She set the photograph back down face first. Outside, thunder echoed through the forest. Sarah walked toward the kitchen and opened one of the cabinets, empty. Another cabinet held old dishes covered in dust. Everything felt untouched, like the cabin had simply been waiting. Waiting for someone to come back. She moved toward the staircase slowly. Each step groaned loudly beneath her feet. At the top of the stairs sat her childhood bedroom. The door was slightly open. Sarah pushed it gently. The room was smaller than she remembered. Moon and star stickers still clung to the ceiling. An old stuffed rabbit rested near the pillow on her tiny bed. She picked it up carefully. Tears burned her eyes instantly. This room held the last pieces of the little girl she used to be before her father disappeared, and her mother became emotionally distant forever. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed quietly, while rain continued hitting the windows. She remembered the final night she saw her father alive. He came home late. His clothes were dirty. Mud covered his hands and boots. But it wasn't the dirt that scared her. It was his face. He looked terrified. Even while smiling at her, his eyes kept drifting toward the windows like he expected someone to appear outside at any second the next morning. Sarah woke to the sound of rain dripping from the roof. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then the creaking walls and cold mountain air brought everything rushing back. The cabin. Her father. The memories. She sat up slowly on the old bed, rubbing her tired eyes. The storm from the night before had passed, but thick gray clouds still covered the sky outside her window. Sarah hadn't slept much. Every noise inside the cabin kept pulling her awake. Floorboards cracking, wind brushing against the walls, the strange feeling that the house was holding onto something it wanted to say. She walked downstairs quietly and made herself coffee using the old rusted kettle she found in the kitchen. The smell filled the cabin with a strange warmth that almost felt comforting. Almost. Cup in hand, Sarah stepped outside onto the porch. The forest looked darker after the rain. Water dripped from the pine trees while fog rolled slowly across the ground. Everything was still. Too still. She looked toward the old garden beside the cabin. Most of it had died years ago. The wooden fence leaned inward, half broken by time. Dead flowers covered the muddy ground. But one spot looked different. Near the center of the garden was a patch of soil darker than the rest. Fresh. Sarah narrowed her eyes. That didn't make sense. Nobody had lived here for decades. Slowly, she stepped off the porch and walked toward it. Mud stuck to her boots with every step. Then she saw it. A shovel. Its wooden handle poked halfway out of the wet dirt like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Sarah stopped moving. A strange feeling crawled up her spine. The shovel looked old, but not ancient, definitely newer than most things inside the cabin. Her heartbeat quickened. She glanced around the empty woods. Nothing. Only silence. Carefully, Sarah grabbed the handle and pulled the shovel free from the mud. Wet soil slid off the metal blade. The ground underneath looked disturbed. Recently disturbed. She swallowed nervously. This is crazy, she whispered to herself. But something deep inside her refused to walk away. Almost without thinking, Sarah pushed the shovel into the soil. The dirt was softer than expected. One scoop. Then another. Rainwater soaked through her jeans as she knelt lower, digging faster now. Her breathing became uneven. Mud covered her hands. The cold air stung her skin. Then suddenly, clank. The sound froze her instantly. Metal. Sarah stared down at the hole. Her chest tightened. She dropped the shovel and started clearing dirt away with her hands. Wet soil packed beneath her fingernails as her fingers brushed against something hard and rusted. A box. She uncovered it slowly. It was a small metal container, old and worn with age. Rust covered the corners, and the lid looked barely attached anymore. Sarah carefully lifted it from the ground. It was heavier than expected. Her hands trembled as she wiped away layers of dirt. Then she saw the word scratched faintly across the top. For Sarah only. Her breath caught instantly. No. No, this couldn't be real. Only one person ever wrote her name like that. Her father. Sarah stumbled backward slightly, staring at the box like it might suddenly disappear. The world around her seemed quieter now. Even the wind had stopped. She carried the box back inside the cabin carefully, setting it down on the kitchen table. Mud dripped onto the wooden floor as she stood there frozen, unsure whether she actually wanted to open it. For 23 years, all she wanted were answers. Now those answers were sitting directly in front of her. And suddenly, she was afraid of them. Sarah reached toward the lid slowly. The rust made it difficult to open. She pulled harder until finally, crack! The seal broke. Dust rose into the air. Inside the box were dozens of items packed tightly together. Old photographs tied with string. Several newspaper clippings. A small cassette tape. Folders wrapped carefully in plastic. And resting on top of everything else, a sealed envelope. Sarah's eyes filled immediately. Her name was written across the front in faded black ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. She could almost hear his voice inside her head again. Calm, gentle, safe. For a long moment, she simply stared at the envelope. Part of her wanted to throw it away without reading it. Because as long as the letter stayed closed, she could still believe whatever version of the past hurt the least. But deep down, Sarah already knew something important the moment she found that box. Her father hadn't simply vanished. He had planned for her to find this one day. Which meant before he disappeared, he knew something terrible was coming. Sarah stared at the envelope for nearly a full minute before finally opening it. Her fingers trembled so badly, she almost tore the paper inside. The cabin was silent, except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound suddenly felt louder. She unfolded the letter carefully. The paper looked worn and yellow from age, but the handwriting was still clear. Her father's handwriting. The sight of it alone made tears gather in her eyes. She began to read. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I was right. One day you would come back here looking for answers. Her breathing slowed. The words felt alive somehow, like he was sitting across from her speaking directly into her heart. I wish I could explain all of this to you face to face, but if this letter reached you instead of me, then things didn't happen the way I hoped. Sarah swallowed hard. Rain tapped softly against the cabin windows while she continued reading. You deserve the truth, especially after everything you were forced to believe. Her eyes moved faster now. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. Sarah froze. The sentence hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had repeated the same painful story inside her mind. Her father abandoned them. He walked away. He chose another life. That lie had shaped her entire childhood. Every birthday without him. Every school event where she searched the crowd hoping he might appear. Every lonely night hearing her mother cry behind closed doors. All those years of anger suddenly began cracking apart. Her hands tightened around the letter. I left because staying would have put both of you in danger. Sarah blinked quickly, trying to understand. Danger. She kept reading. Her father explained how he worked years earlier for a land development company that purchased forests and rural properties across the state. At first, he believed the company was helping build new communities. But eventually, he discovered something horrifying. The company had secretly been dumping toxic chemical waste deep inside protected forest land surrounding nearby towns, including the woods near the cabin. Illegal barrels were buried underground at night, while officials were bribed to stay silent. People living in nearby areas began getting sick. Animals disappeared. Water sources became contaminated. And when her father threatened to expose everything, they threatened him back. Sarah's chest tightened painfully. The words on the page suddenly felt heavier. They told me accidents happen in isolated places. They made sure I understood exactly what could happen to my family if I spoke publicly. Sarah covered her mouth slowly. A cold feeling spread through her body. This wasn't abandonment. This was fear. Real fear. Her father had gathered evidence secretly for months. Photographs, recorded conversations, financial documents, everything hidden inside the metal box buried beneath the garden. He planned to hand everything over to investigators. But before he could, someone inside the company warned him that certain people were already watching the cabin. Watching Sarah. Watching her mother. I realized then that if I stayed, you would become targets. Tears slid down Sarah's face silently. The image of her father from that final night suddenly became clearer now. The dirt on his boots. The panic in his eyes. The way he kept checking the windows. He wasn't preparing to leave his family. He was trying to save them. I wanted to tell you goodbye properly, but your mother begged me not to risk it. We knew they were close. Sarah's breathing became shaky. Her mother knew. The realization struck her deeply. For decades, her mother allowed Sarah to believe the worst about him. Not because she hated him. Because she was protecting the secret. Protecting Sarah. Sarah looked around the empty cabin slowly. All those years she blamed both of them. All those years of resentment. And meanwhile, they had both been carrying unimaginable fear alone. She wiped her tears quickly and continued reading. I thought disappearing for a few months would be enough. I thought once the evidence became public, things would calm down. But they didn't. According to the letter, several people connected to the company died mysteriously before investigators could question them. Witnesses vanished. Cases were buried. Powerful people made sure the truth stayed hidden. Her father realized returning home would only endanger them again. So he stayed away, watching from a distance whenever he safely could. I missed every moment of your life, Sarah, and not one day passed where I didn't regret it. The tears came harder now. Sarah lowered the letter briefly, overwhelmed by grief. Not the grief of losing him. The grief of misunderstanding him for so long. Every painful memory now carried a different meaning. He didn't abandon her. He sacrificed himself. And somehow that truth hurt even more. Then Sarah noticed one final paragraph near the bottom of the page. The handwriting looked shakier there. Almost rushed. There's one more thing you need to know. Her heartbeat quickened again. Your mother never stopped loving me, and before she died, she asked me to forgive myself for choosing survival over goodbye. Sarah sat frozen at the kitchen table long after finishing the letter. Rain continued sliding down the cabin windows while the old clock ticked steadily beside her. Nothing inside her felt real anymore. Her entire life had been built on a story that wasn't true. The father she hated for disappearing had actually spent decades protecting her from shadows she never even knew existed. And somehow that truth hurt more than abandonment ever did. Her eyes drifted back toward the metal box. Most of its contents still remained untouched. Photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and the small cassette tape resting near the bottom. A strip of faded tape across it carried handwritten words. Play this last. Sarah stared at it nervously. Her father had wanted her to hear this after learning everything else. Which meant whatever was on that tape mattered. A lot. She stood slowly and walked toward the living room. Near the fireplace sat an old tape recorder covered in dust. Sarah wiped it clean with her sleeve and pressed the eject button. The machine groaned weakly but opened. "Please work," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she inserted the cassette. For a second, nothing happened. Then, click. Static filled the room. A loud crackling noise echoed through the cabin speakers. Sarah held her breath. Then she heard it. Her father's voice. Older, tired, but unmistakably his. "Hey, Peanuts." Sarah instantly broke. A sob escaped her mouth before she could stop it. Nobody had called her that since she was 8 years old. Tears streamed down her face as she slowly lowered herself onto the couch. "I don't know how old you are when you hear this," the recording continued softly, "but I imagine you're probably angry at me." Sarah closed her eyes tightly. "You deserved a father who stayed, I know that." The tape crackled again. I replayed that last night in my head thousands of times, wondering if I should have just taken the risk and stayed with you both anyway. Sarah covered her mouth, crying harder now. "But if I had, you may never have grown up at all." The room felt colder suddenly. Outside, wind rattled the cabin windows. Her father coughed lightly on the tape before continuing. "I watched you whenever I safely could." Sarah's eyes opened slowly. "I saw your high school graduation from across the street. Blue cap, white shoes. You kept looking around like you expected someone." Her breathing stopped for a second, because she remembered that day. She remembered searching the crowd. Hopping. "I wanted to run over and hug you so badly." Sarah buried her face into her hands. "I saw you leave for college too. You looked just like your mother that day." Another pause. "You were never abandoned, Sarah, not for 1 second." The tape hissed softly again. Then his voice changed slightly. More serious now. "There's something else I never told anyone." Sarah looked toward the recorder. "If you're hearing this, then it's finally safe enough." Safe enough. Her heart began pounding again. "There's something hidden beneath the cabin floorboards." Sarah frowned slightly. Under the fireplace. The tape crackled loudly. "It contains everything I couldn't carry with me." Sarah slowly sat upright. "Money, documents, and something that can help you find me if I'm still alive." Her entire body went still. "Find him." The tape continued. "If you choose to look, follow the coordinates." Sarah stared at the recorder in disbelief. Then the final words came. "Some promises take longer to keep." Click. Silence. Complete silence filled the cabin again. Sarah couldn't move. Her father might still be alive. After 23 years. The thought barely felt possible. Part of her wanted to dismiss it instantly. Maybe the tape was decades old. Maybe he never survived long enough to return. But another part of her, the little girl who never stopped waiting, suddenly woke up again. Sarah stood abruptly and grabbed the shovel leaning beside the door. Her hands shook violently as she hurried toward the fireplace. The old wooden boards creaked beneath her feet. Under the fireplace. "That's what he said." She dropped to her knees and began pulling at the loose floorboards near the stone foundation. Dust filled the air while splinters scraped against her fingers. Nothing. She moved another board aside. Still nothing. Frustration and panic started building inside her chest. Then, thunk. The shovel hit something solid beneath the floor. Sarah froze instantly. Her breathing quickened. She shoved the remaining boards aside desperately until finally she saw it. A small waterproof container hidden beneath the cabin floor. Her pulse roared in her ears. She pulled it free carefully and placed it beside her. The container looked newer than the time capsule outside, like someone had hidden it there more recently. Sarah opened it slowly. Inside was a stack of cash wrapped tightly in plastic. Several passports under different names, old legal documents, and one photograph. Sarah picked it up carefully. The second she saw the image, her entire body went numb. It was her father. Older now, gray in his beard, wrinkles around his eyes, but alive, standing beside the cabin. The photograph looked recent, maybe only a few years old. Tears instantly blurred Sarah's vision again. Oh my God! Her hands shook uncontrollably as she flipped the photograph over. Written on the back were 6 words. Some promises take longer to keep. Underneath the sentence were coordinates. Specific coordinates. Sarah grabbed her phone immediately and entered them into the map. The location appeared deep in the mountains, 2 hours north of the cabin. A remote area near a frozen lake. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. This was real. He wanted her to find him. Or at least he once had. Fear suddenly crept into her thoughts. What if she was too late? What if he had already died? What if this place was abandoned too? But hope moved stronger than fear now. For the first time in 23 years, Sarah wasn't chasing memories. She was chasing the possibility of getting her father back. The storm clouds finally began breaking outside as evening sunlight pushed weakly through the trees. Sarah packed quickly. Flashlight. Keys. The photograph. The letter. She barely noticed her own tears anymore. Her mind kept replaying his voice from the tape. You were never abandoned. All those lonely birthdays. All those nights crying herself to sleep believing she wasn't worth staying for. Every painful piece of her life suddenly looked different now. Not rejection. Sacrifice. Her father gave up everything to keep her alive. And somehow, after all these years, he might still be waiting. Sarah stepped outside the cabin as cold wind swept through the trees. The garden behind her looked peaceful again, hiding no more secrets beneath the soil. The same place that once held decades of silence had finally given her the truth. She climbed into the truck and looked back at the cabin one last time. Then she whispered softly through trembling lips, "Please still be there." The drive through the mountains felt endless. Fog covered the narrow road so heavily that Sarah could barely see beyond the headlights. Pine trees surrounded her on both sides like dark walls stretching endlessly into the night. Her hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire time. Every few minutes, she glanced at the photograph lying on the passenger seat. Her father. Alive. Even after staring at the picture 100 times, it still didn't feel real. Part of her feared she was chasing a ghost. Another part feared something even worse, finding the cabin empty and realizing she had arrived too late. The coordinates eventually led her onto a smaller dirt road hidden deep within the mountains. The path looked barely used. Snow covered sections of the ground while freezing wind rattled the trees overhead. Sarah's heart pounded harder with every mile. Then suddenly, she saw it. A small cabin beside a frozen lake. Warm light glowed faintly through one of the windows. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney into the dark sky. Sarah stopped breathing. The truck rolled to a halt. For several seconds, she simply stared. He was here. Or at least someone was. Her hands trembled violently as she stepped out into the cold night air. Snow crunched beneath her boots while icy wind brushed across her face. The cabin looked old but cared for. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the porch. Footprints marked the snow near the front steps. Someone lived here. Sarah slowly walked toward the door. Every step felt unreal. 23 years of questions. 23 years of anger. 23 years of pain. All leading to this moment. She raised her shaking hand and knocked softly. No answer. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then she heard movement inside. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. The door creaked open. An older man stood there beneath the warm light. Gray hair. Tired eyes. Lines carved deeply across his face by time. But none of that mattered, because Sarah recognized him instantly. The same eyes from her childhood memories. The same gentle expression. The same face she spent half her life trying to forget. Her father. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to disappear completely. Sarah felt tears rising before she could stop them. His eyes filled too. Then finally, in a broken whisper, he said, "Sarah." The sound of her name and his voice shattered something inside her completely. She burst into tears. Her father stepped forward just as she collapsed into his arms. For the first time in 23 years, she felt his embrace again. Warm. Real. Safe. Both of them cried without holding back. Years of pain poured out all at once beneath the falling snow. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over while holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry." Sarah couldn't even speak. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways throughout her life. Sometimes with anger. Sometimes with screaming. Sometimes with silence. But now, standing in his arms again, none of that mattered anymore. Because despite everything, she never stopped needing her father. Eventually, he brought her inside. The cabin smelled like burning wood and coffee. It was small and simple, filled with books, maps, and old photographs carefully placed along the shelves. One photograph immediately caught Sarah's attention. It was her college graduation picture, taken from far away. Another showed her walking beside her husband years earlier. Another showed her standing near her mother at a grocery store. Sarah stared at them in disbelief. "You really watched all those years?" she asked quietly. Her father nodded slowly. "Whenever it was safe." Tears filled her eyes again. "You were there." "I never left in my heart," he whispered. They sat beside the fireplace for hours while he told her everything. How he spent years moving from place to place after exposing powerful people connected to the illegal dumping operation. How several individuals involved mysteriously disappeared before authorities could fully investigate. How he constantly feared someone would eventually find Sarah if he ever returned openly. He explained how her mother secretly stayed in contact with him through coded letters for years. "She hated lying to you," he said softly, "but she believed it was the only way to protect you." Sarah lowered her eyes. For so long, she carried resentment toward her mother too. Now she understood the burden her mother carried alone all those years. Protecting a secret painful enough to destroy their family if revealed. Her father slowly reached into a drawer beside the fireplace. "There's something your mother wanted you to have." He handed Sarah an envelope. Her chest tightened instantly when she recognized the handwriting. Her mother. Sarah opened it carefully. Inside was a single letter written shortly before her mother died. "My sweet girl. If you're reading this, then somehow you found your way back to him. There are truths a parent never wants their child to carry. I wanted you to have a normal life, a safe life, even if it meant you hated us for a while." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. "Your father loved you every single day he was gone, and I loved him every single day too." Sarah covered her mouth, crying silently. We broke our own hearts to protect yours." The fire crackled softly beside them while Sarah finished reading. "And one day I hope you understand that love is not always loud. Sometimes love is sacrifice. Sometimes it is silence. And sometimes it is letting go, even when it destroys you inside." Sarah lowered the letter slowly. For years she believed silence meant abandonment. Now she finally understood. Sometimes silence was protection. Sometimes the deepest love came with the greatest pain. Her father looked at her carefully from across the fire. "I know I can't get those years back," he said quietly, "and I know I don't deserve forgiveness easily." Sarah stared at him through tears, then slowly shook her head. "You came back," she whispered. His eyes filled again. "No," Sarah said softly, "you stayed alive." The room fell silent. But this silence felt different. Not empty. Not painful. Peaceful. Outside, snow continued falling across the frozen lake, while warmth filled the small cabin for the first time in decades. And for the first time since she was 8 years old, Sarah no longer felt abandoned. She felt found. The next morning, sunlight covered the mountains in soft gold. Sarah stood outside the cabin beside her father while cold wind moved through the trees gently. After decades of darkness, fear, and separation, they were finally standing together again beneath the same sky. Not as strangers, not as broken pieces of the past, but as family. And sometimes, life waits until the very last moment to return what the heart never truly stopped searching for. Moral: never judge someone's silence before knowing the pain they carried. Sometimes the people who seem far away are the ones who loved us enough to sacrifice everything for our safety and happiness. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or incidents is purely coincidental. The purpose of this video is to inspire emotion, suspense, and meaningful storytelling.